Hello everyone, welcome to Dnyanadeep Academy. In this session, we are going to discuss some ethics PYQs. Here is question on your screen that is from UPSC 2023 paper. The question is saying, in the context of work environment, differentiate between coercion and undue influence with suitable examples. Fine. Now the question itself has set the context. It is directly asking about the work environment, and often we find that at work environment the work culture is such that some coercion tactics, undue influence, or also sometimes politics is used as a means of getting work done, right? So this is the context which has been set by the question itself. Even then we will find that what dimensions of ethics are involved in this particular part. So one dimension is work culture. We expect everywhere, be it government offices or corporate offices, work culture should be based on ethical principles. Okay? So that is the dimension of ethics I am identifying. Moral values. Every workspace should carry its own moral values. Also, the individuals working there and the leadership working in that particular workplace should also emphasize on moral values. And ultimately, attitude is one of the most important part which is going to influence the work culture and also the moral values of an institution, an individual, and the leader. Fine. So this is the dimension under which we are going to address this particular question. Now, addressing this particular question is quite straightforward. Fine. The only thing is you need to introduce some of the keywords from ethics syllabus so as to make this particular question look more like an ethics question. Fine. Otherwise, what will happen if we only focus on work environment, undue influence, or coercion, and if we end up writing a very generalistic answer, that might look like a very management academic answer, right? So if you are doing any management course, even in that management course there will be some of these topics, right? But since we are writing it from an ethical perspective, that is why I have talked about moral values, and that is why I am going to talk about attitude. So somewhere or the other that particular part needs to be reflected. Now let's try to introduce. I can talk about healthy work environment, why healthy work environment is important, why healthy work environment is necessary, or I can also talk about a work environment which is devoid of any influence, right? So in the language of ethics, I'll say that I need a healthy work environment which is based on moral values and principles. Fine. Or that work environment should also be devoid of any undue influence. Now this is a very generalistic introduction, since this question is talking more about this particular concept. So what is going to happen in this introduction wala part, that you might not have very specific to introduce with, right? There may be one approach where people are introducing directly with coercion or undue influence. So maybe in one line you will define coercion and in next line you will define undue influence. So that is also one way to introduce in this particular part, but I am going to reserve all those ingredients for a later part, because that is again I could be short on content in my body part, since we have to very much focused while answering this particular question, and that is why I am taking a very broad view. I am talking about work environment. I am talking about a work environment maybe based on principles of ethics and moral values. So having introduced in a slightly generalistic way, here I go with my body part. Now in body part, I have to talk about the coercion and undue influence, and I have to differentiate between them. There are two ways to write an answer where difference has been asked. You can have two segments or you can make two columns. Both are fine, both are appropriate. Now it depends totally what choice you make writing exactly in the exam hall. Here, just because I could not manage whole of my content on one page, I have made two separate segments or two separate paragraphs. But generally, even in my case, I would prefer to make a table. I'll simply make a table. Fine. In one column, I'll write about coercion. In another column, I'll write about undue influence. After that, first and foremost, I will mention what this coercion is, and in here, I'll mention what this undue influence is. Now, in next point, I will talk about the impact of coercion, and then I will talk about the impact of undue influence. And lastly, I can choose to write some more differentiating points. There are some points which are exclusive to coercion. There are certain points which are very exclusive to undue influence. So that those can also be mentioned. And finally, you have to sum up with the example. Write an example which will give summary of this particular act. Or similarly, you have to write an example where you get summary of undue influence. So that is how you are supposed to approach when there is a question which is asking you to differentiate between two ideas. If it is not possible to make columns, then putting it in segments is also completely fine. Now, see what coercion is. I have it's very generic content. You don't need to emphasize much on the content, because more or less everyone will write the same. You just have to make sure that there are some differences you are mentioning which are different than others' answer. Something which is very specific to ethics you are supposed to do. So coercion is a tactic used to force someone to do something against their will, right? And it can take many forms, including physical violence, emotional manipulation, and threats of harms. Fine. So this is my coercion. Here I also have given one example what coercion exactly is. So employer threatening an employee with termination if they do not work overtime without proper compensation. So this is very often we find that in India or in most of the developing world, there are acts of coercion in work culture. And why these acts of work coercion in work culture perpetuate? It is because of loose corporate governance, right? So this is one of that particular case which we find often. Now, I have just told you what coercion is. You have to give one more layer of ethics which is involved in this particular part. Now, what ethical issue is involved? You have to mention. What is the ethical issue? Ethical issue is you are acting against the free will of a person. Fine. Also, you are making a culture which is not valuing work. Whatever work an individual is doing, it needs to be properly valued. It needs to be properly compensated. And that is very basic ethics which we need to follow. Fine. So your work is not going to get valued. Even if you are willing to do some work, and if you are not getting compensated, right? Either it may happen that you don't want to do some work, so it is certainly going to act against your free will. And another thing, that your value of the work or compensation you are getting against the work you are doing is also absent. Fine. So these are some of the ethical issues which are involved in case of coercion. Also, in case of undue influence, the issue is not going to be very different. Okay. So let's talk about undue influence. So in undue influence, what we do? We are using power. See, what was the case of coercion? In coercion, we threatened. It was more about a threat. Fine. When it comes to undue influence, it is an influence on decision making, right? So I'm not threatening you in this particular case. I'm just influencing you. I'm maybe influencing you in an implicit manner, or that influence could be explicit also. Fine. But here I'm not having anything which will threaten you, right? When it comes to coercion, I found that you are vulnerable with something. Okay. So that is one more ethical issue which you can identify when it comes to coercion. What happened in the case of coercion? I identified your vulnerability, right? And I made that vulnerability as a tool, and then I acted against you. So that is an act of coercion. Now, in case of undue influence, what is the thing? It may or may not be. May have some vulnerability, you may not have some vulnerability. But I know that I come from a position of power and I can offer something such as some gratitude, some illicit gratitude can be offered when it comes to undue influence, right? I will offer you that, and in return, what I will expect? I'll expect that you will be doing some of my work. Now, while doing that work, what is going to happen? It may happen that work is legal, or it may also happen that work is not within the legal framework, right? Now, when it comes to coercion, there may or may not be an issue of legality, but when it comes to undue influence, there is also an issue of legality. There is ethics involved, but there is also one more layer, that is of legality, which is involved. Now, we have identified difference between coercion and undue influence. In coercion, there was threat. In undue influence, there is something which is being offered. It can be done through extending certain advantages such as expensive gifts or some favor. Some favor is giving, right? Coercion, there was threat. Undue influence, I have some favor for you. There is example, a supervisor offering subordinate a promotion, knowing subordinate is in a financial distress. But once I do this, once I offer you a promotion, now in this particular case, what has happened? I already said it may be or it may not be a case of vulnerability. You may or may not be in a position of vulnerability. Fine. So what happened? I, as a supervisor, I promoted you. Clear? It may be that you are not that much deserving for a promotion. Fine. Your promotion was not due either. But what I did, I had power. I promoted you. And once I promoted you, I am expecting something to be done from your side. Fine. So this is what undue influence is. Because now once I promoted you, even when you did not deserve or your promotion was not due, now you will be under a constant pressure that since some of your senior has promoted you, you also have some obligation towards that person. Fine. And while fulfilling that obligation, you might end up doing some illicit work. Okay. So that is what the fundamental difference between coercion and undue influence as a concept is. So all these things need to be mentioned. That is about these two ideas. Now moving towards the conclusion. Now in conclusion, again, I'm talking about some unethical practices which I have already anyway mentioned. So I'm talking about restriction of free will, restriction of autonomy. In both of the cases, there is restriction of free will and autonomy, right? So in coercion, you are not acting in with free will because you are being threatened. In undue influence, again, you are not acting as a matter of free will because now you are under some pressure, under some obligation to provide some benefits to your seniors. Fine. So there is a lack of free will, there is lack of autonomy. Also, using fear is not just at workplace. Whatever tactics of fears which are being used is absolutely not legal. Also, it is not ethical at workplace. Fine. So this is what undue influence and coercion is. Now we have to move forward one more step. So this can be very basic and generic introduction. I can also provide a way forward, and in way forward, then I can talk about, let's have code of ethics, let's have code of conduct, let's have better corporate governance. So this can go with a conclusion as a way forward. One generic conclusion can be this needs to be presented. At the same time, I also need to present some way forward where I am talking about better code of ethics, better code of conduct, and better corporate governance, so that there is no act of coercion and undue influence, right? So there are some legal provisions in India also, or corporate governance of India, where there are provisions which restricts such tactics such as coercion and undue influence. So see you again in next session.